Welcome to the Fast Leader Podcast, where we uncover the leadership life hacks that help you to experience breakout performance faster and rocket to success. And now, here's your host, customer and employee engagement expert and certified emotional intelligence practitioner, Jim Rimbach.
Call Center Coach develops and unites the next generation of call center leaders. Through our e-learning and community, individuals gain knowledge and skills in the 6 core competencies that is the blueprint that develops high-performing call center leaders. Successful supervisors do not just happen. So go to callcentercoach.com to learn more about enrollment and download your copy of the Supervisor Success Path ebook now. Okay, Fast Leader Legion. Today we're going to have a great discussion because we have Adam Bryant on the show today. Adam, welcome.
Thanks so much, Jim. Looking forward to it.
Now, a little bit about Adam is that Adam Bryant was born in Montreal and spent many of his years living in both Canada and the United States. He had trouble sitting still as a kid and was always busy. He played a ton of sports, delivered papers, and did other odd jobs to buy a car when he turned 16. He's always liked to work, whatever the job was, washing dishes in a restaurant, working in factories, or on a drilling rig in Western Canada. His father was a journalist and his mother was an occupational therapist, and he learned from them the importance of selflessness and listening. His father especially was a world-class listener, and Adam would watch him draw people out to share their stories. Adam caught the journalism bug in college while working on his college paper in Toronto. He also met his future wife in that city. They both worked at the same restaurant for a part-time job when they were in school. He dreamed of one day possibly working for the New York Times, and after working at smaller papers, he managed to join the paper as an entry-level reporter before he turned 30. He worked there as a reporter and editor for 18 years, with a 6-year break in the middle when he worked at Newsweek magazine. Adam's interest in leadership grew as he started interviewing CEOs as a business reporter. For years, he followed the established approach of writing about CEOs as strategists, how they plan to win in their industry. But the more time he spent with them, the more he wanted to set aside those questions and ask them how they do their jobs. That led Adam to create his weekly corner office series in the New York Times, which was based on a very simple what if question. What if he sat down with CEOs and never asked them about their companies and instead asked them about the most important leadership lessons they had learned over their career? That led to over 1,000 interviews with CEOs and other senior leaders and 4 books, including his latest book, The Leap to Leader: How Ambitious Managers Make the Jump to Leadership, published by Harvard Business Review Press. In 2017, Adam left the New York Times to join the XCO Group, an executive mentoring and leadership development firm where he's a senior managing director. He and his wife now live in New Orleans. Adam Bryant, thank you for joining the show and helping us all get over the hump.
Thanks for having me, Jim. Looking forward to it.
Now, before as I said, I'm looking forward to this discussion because, and we're going to talk about this in a second, things have changed so much. But before we even look at leadership and what it actually entails, you talk about a crucial question that both an individual as well as an organization needs to ask. And that question is, why do you really want to lead? Why is that question so important?
I think it's because it's not asked enough. I think when people are early in their career and they're moving up and they're ambitious, they often is like, yeah, I want that job, that higher title, that bigger leadership role. And they don't really do the sort of internal reflection and excavation work on why they actually want the job. Because a lot of people, when they're early in their career, they're really good at something and they, that's why people want to promote them. And there's this kind of natural assumption. It's like this momentum that just carries people along into these bigger leadership roles. And then sometimes people get in those roles and they go, wow, I had no idea that this is what the job entailed, right? Like they may have had a vision where, they were going to be leading and setting strategy and doing all these cool things. But then you find out you're dealing with a lot of people and a lot of, challenges that people have. Human beings are super complicated. And so they get into these roles and they go, wow, like I'm putting out fires all day. Like I've got a line outside my door. I don't even have time to do my work. And there's a lot of rewarding aspects of leadership, but people need to really go into these roles with their eyes fully open of what it entails. And I think from an organizational point of view, a lot of the time they're looking at the succession pipeline. And again, there's that assumption that it's like, okay, all these people want to move up. All these people should move up. Instead of stopping and asking people, do you really want this leadership role, as opposed to staying in some individual contributor role? And I think that reflection, that internal excavation work, if you do think you want a leadership role, is to be crystal clear on why you want it. And I think if the reasons are power and money, those aren't going to be satisfying, because the idea of like power and dictatorial bosses, like we're kind of moving away from that. And these jobs come with a lot of trade-offs, a lot of sacrifices. These are 3-shift jobs, these top leadership roles. And the money's not going to seem like enough. So you need to be very clear with yourself about why you want these jobs before you step into them, so you're not surprised.
As you say that, I start thinking about a lot of the people who I interact with, talking about that whole 3-shift role scenario, and that happens at all levels. I mean, because even at the frontline level, the ones that are getting all the work done, and the midline leaders who are helping, working on executing, business operations and making sure that things are in alignment. Isn't the 3-shift really kind of been for everybody? And maybe, that's one of the reasons why we've had so many changes and resignations, and people kind of said, I'm done. Right. Are these all contributing factors to this?
I think so. And because, you mentioned the Great Resignation and also quiet quitting, which came out as a hashtag. And I was very curious when that came out. Is this going to be like a 3-week thing or a 3-month thing? And like a year later, people were still talking about it. I really made it a priority for me to talk to a lot of people who are much younger than me about what is this about, right? And the first thing we need to understand about quiet quitting is that quiet quitting is a branding problem, Jim, because it's not about quitting. You talk to enough kids, and what it's really about is about boundaries, to your point, right? Just because the pandemic, you're sitting at home, there's no such thing as like a bad day at work, a good day at home, a good day at, like it all blurs, right? And they just needed a sense of boundaries. And so I think a lot of people are working hard to create those. But the reality of these top leadership roles, the way our society is structured right now, I've come to appreciate these are jobs as much as anything, right? Like there's that early morning shift where you get through 100 emails, you spend all day at meetings, and then at night, after dinner or whatever, you're looking at another 3 or 4 hours to actually do the work that you needed to do at work that you couldn't do at work, and also to get through the other 300 emails. And you just have to you need a certain amount of stamina, a certain amount of drive to be able to do that, because it is relentless.
Well, okay. So in the book, you were even talking about your own journey in regards to moving in and out of, leader and leading roles. So, was the moving in and out a reflection of, just, a path that was taken, or was it maybe a subconscious, maybe even a conscious and intentional move to say, you know what, I don't think I'm really wanting this. And so therefore I'm going to go out. And then it's like, well, maybe I do want it. And I went back in. Was that kind of an indecision move?
Yeah. So interesting through line. One of the lines I mentioned in the book is that leadership is complicated, and it is okay to have a complicated relationship with leadership, right? Like it is not a binary, are you a leader or are you not a leader? And in my own career as a journalist, I managed a lot of teams of reporters. I had roles where I was number 2 to the top person in a couple of big news departments. And I ran a couple of smaller departments myself, like the climate change coverage desk at the Times. And I found my sweet spot of like, I'm good with a small team because I just knew myself well enough that I really like to be close to the actual work, the actual journalism, the stories, helping reporters craft and write and really driving coverage. So I had a couple of moments in my career, to be completely honest, where I turned down a couple of promotions because I had been in the number 2 job. I sat 3 feet from the guy who did the number 1 job in the department. And I knew what he did all day long. And it's like, I'm not good at a lot of things that you do. And I know what I'm good at. And I frankly don't want to do a lot of things that you have to do. And I've never really been motivated by title, right? I know he had a bigger title than me, and I think a lot of people chase bigger titles and things like that. But I really, in the journalism part of my career, I really liked staying close to the stories, working with reporters. That was what I was really good at. And I just made a decision, and, whatever the consequences were in terms of the arc of my career, but I was fine living with the consequences of those decisions because, again, I knew what I liked. I knew what I was good at.
So obviously the self-awareness piece is critical and key. And I'm going to go back to that answering of the question is, do you really want to lead? There's a piece of research that talks about the, vital attributes that people need to have in order to be successful in the role. And this particular study talked about the number one and most important attribute being that you want to help others to be successful. And what that means is they may even surpass you, in the hierarchical order of the organization. And all these interviews that you've done within an organization, did you find, or leaders, did you find that as a common thread and attribute amongst all of them?
I think so. And the way the older I get, the more I like sentences that begin with, there's only two kinds of people, Jim. And if you could find a framework that makes sense. And I have found, I've worked for some great bosses in my time. I've worked for some really bad bosses in my time. And the framework that I've developed was like, there's only two kinds of bosses, and those who are more self-centered and those who are more selfless. I know people talk about servant leadership, but that's like a 50-year-old term, and we can have a side conversation about that. But to me, the most useful framework, and just think about all the people you've worked with, bosses and people listening, all the people that you've worked for in your career. And I think they fall into one of those two camps. And bosses who are more self-centered, it's like, what have you done for me? What can you do for me? How are you going to make me look bad? How are you going to disappoint me? Everything is about them. Whereas I think a more selfless approach is like, how can I help you succeed? And I just think that self-centered, like people who are super self-centered are narcissists, right? And look, there's still a lot of bad bosses in the world. There's a lot of bad leaders. A lot of them are narcissists, and they are successful, certainly in the short run, maybe in the long run in some cases. But I just think that if you really want to be a leader, you got to have followers, and those followers have to trust you, and they have to believe that you are there to help them and the organization rather than just yourself.
Okay, so prior to COVID, there was a study that I was reviewing that talked about HR leaders, human resource leaders, said that only 19% of them feel that they have enough people in their pipeline in order to fill the leadership roles that are needed within their organization. Just 19%. And that was prior to COVID. Where do you think that number would be today?
I would guess it's gone down, because one of the things that we have seen in a lot of our work is that, well, for context, I think that leadership has gotten, pick a number, Jim, like 5 times harder, 10 times harder since the start of COVID, and not just because of COVID. Stakeholder capitalism. I mean, there's just so many reasons why it's become so much harder. And I think a lot of people are looking at these bigger jobs and they're just saying, I'm out. Like, I didn't sign up for that. And we have seen that movie a lot with people who had a really good trajectory and were on their way to the C-suite. I also think that, manager roles have become so much harder because suddenly you're having to have conversations and you're getting all these messages that can feel like contradictory messages, right? Like, you got to be compassionate, right? You got to be empathetic. You got to understand people are dealing with a lot, but you have to drive performance. And so there's a lot of these conversations like, somebody please hand me a playbook for how to have this conversation, because I don't know how to do it. And so, it is a pain point for a lot of organizations where they do feel like they need their managers to step up as leaders, to have this mindset. It's like, okay, I'm going to help you write the playbook rather than sitting here with my arms folded across my chest, waiting for you to hand me the playbook. So, I often talk about, like, when I'm talking to younger audiences, especially, it's like, people need to be aware, like, we are living through a breathtaking moment of change, right? The nature of work, the nature of leadership. I mean, things were pretty stable for a few decades there. And I think people have to do a gut check. They have to ask themselves, it's like, do you find this exciting? Do you want to be a part of this moment where we're figuring out the playbook together? There's no right answers anymore. Just the whole idea of best practices has come into question, because what's a best practice at your company might not work at my company because it's a different context. And so with all these new challenges, you have to find that exciting. Otherwise, you're going to just start feeling overwhelmed pretty quickly.
Okay, so help me with a little bit of clarity here. You talk about creating a playbook, but then you also state in the book that there is no right path. What's the difference between the two?
So the playbook that I talk about is leadership, and in the sense that we are trying to figure out all these things together. When I use the phrase "there's no right path," that's much more specifically about people's career paths. So, I often find when I'm talking to younger audiences, college grads or people in college, I find that younger people often have, first of all, incredibly specific timelines and plans for their careers, right? By this age, I want to have this title, and by making this much money, and when I'm 30, when I'm 35. And I always say, first of all, like, life doesn't work that way, right? Your career path is going to be much more influenced by the connections you make along the way, and people will bring you along. But secondly, I find often when people are sort of mid-career, they start asking themselves, am I on the right path, right? If I want to get to that top job, should I get more international experience, or should I go deep on my particular function or area of expertise? There's all these questions, like, so there's a sense of what is the right path? And what I always tell people is there is no right path, right? Directionally, there are some obvious things you have to do. If you want to be CEO of a really big company, you shouldn't be working for a startup, right? There's some obvious things to do. But once you do that, what I always tell people, there's no right path, but the path you are on is the right path for you if, and here is the big if, is that if you keep your eyes open and you learn lessons from all the experiences you are having. Because to me, this is what separates people. We're all going through life having experiences, but the thing that separates people from me is whether they are taking those experiences, and the metaphor I use is almost like a wet towel, like, the towel, like the wet towel of your experience. Like, do you then take that towel and start wringing it for, like, I'm going to get every drop of insight and lesson that I can out of this? Like, just because if you keep your eyes open, there's lessons everywhere. It's like, you can learn from bad bosses. You can watch great bosses and managers and teams and colleagues. And if you just spend some time on the reflection and do some processing and pattern matching, the lessons are everywhere, and you can just learn a ton. And I often, I've interviewed more than 1,000 leaders by now, and I've got some favorite things I've heard. And a woman named Ruth Simmons, she'd been the president of 3 different colleges. She would often tell her students at these colleges, or her advice was, always be prepared to learn at any moment the most important lesson of your life. And I think that is just amazing advice, because if you go through your day always saying, at any moment, I could learn the most important lesson of my life, you're going to keep your eyes and ears open.
I could definitely see that. And in the book, you talk a lot about mindset and mindsets. And I think that rolls into what you talk about in regards to the reality check of what leadership roles actually entail. If you could kind of enlighten us a little bit on the reality check.
Yeah. And so listen, I think leadership is probably one of the hardest things on the planet to do well, right? That's why I'm sort of endlessly fascinated about it, because there's just so many nuances. And if you agree that leadership is super hard, then we ask, well, why is it so hard? And there's a lot of reasons, but the thing that I keep coming back to is that leadership is hard because it is a series of what feels like contradictions or balancing acts or paradoxes. I always say that if you're a new manager just starting out and you want to start reading up on advice, I say, buy yourself a neck brace, because you are going to get whiplash from all the contradictory advice that you're going to hear, right? Like, create a sense of urgency, but be patient, bring people along, be compassionate, hold people accountable, be inclusive, make sure everybody has a sense of belonging, but you got to be really clear about what you stand for and what you don't stand for. You got to listen, make sure people feel like they are heard, but you have to have the courage to make decisions. And you can just find all these, what can feel like mixed messages, completely overwhelming. And I think an important insight when you go into these leadership roles, especially today, is this simple point that all these things that feel like contradictions, that feel like or propositions, is it this or that, are really and propositions. It is not one or the other, it is both. And you need to understand that as a leader, you have to live in that sort of sweet spot between in that balance point, and then flex as you need based on the circumstances and the context, so that one minute you may need to create a sense of urgency, but in the next meeting, you may need to be patient. And that is what sort of the infinite challenge of leadership is. Every day is a new day. You're not going to get those balancing acts right, but you need to understand the balancing acts to help you make sense of these leadership roles.
As you're saying that, I start thinking about, he just mentioned situational leadership. We talked about servant leadership. There's all, and even that, it's like, okay, what model do I follow? Right.
Right. Exactly. And, I generally don't think I will confess that I've spent, probably about 13, 14 years in the leadership space now. And I'm always a little skeptical when people want to put like an adjective in front of the word leadership, right? Because I get that because leadership is so hard, we're all trying to simplify it. We're all trying to create a framework. And it's good to simplify the complexity, but we shouldn't oversimplify it.
Okay. So talking about, and we hit this on a couple different instances, complexity, uncertainty, volatility, ambiguity. There's an acronym that was created a long time ago called VUCA. As I jokingly say, is like, that was yesterday, it's today, and it'll be tomorrow. I mean,
right.
Accept it, right? There's nothing there's nothing I can do about it because it is out of my control in regards to those things. And so that kind of leads me into pre-COVID, post-COVID, and you say leadership has become many times harder since 2020. How so?
Well, before 2020, I would have said that the key job of leaders is to simplify complexity, right? And we can, if you and I were in front of a whiteboard and say, what do leaders do? What do they need to do? We could probably put 300 things on there, but I would put very near the top of the list, if not at the top of the list, the leader's job is to simplify complexity, to take everything that's going on in the world, their industry, their company, and boil it down into a simple statement so they could stand up at an all hands meeting and say to all the employees, this is where we're going, this is how we're going to get there, and this is when we're going to get there. To me, like, that was a leader's job. Post 2020, I would keep that, but I would add a second beat, which is, it's not just your job to simplify complexity. First, you have to embrace complexity. And I say that because, as you were saying in the sort of in the on-ramp to this, like, the world has gotten so much more complicated, right? Like ambiguity, disruption, all the things that we know and that we live with every day. And so leaders have to be much more mindful about the fact that there's things that they don't know, right? Because when they're simplifying complexity, they're doing that with the data points that they have in front of them. But now they have to constantly be asking themselves, like, what data points don't I have that I need to include in my framework when I'm trying to simplify complexity? And so you need to spend much more time exploring all these things that could come out of nowhere. Like, what is AI going to do to your business, right? Like, you don't know, but you need to look into that. And so to me, like, that is the key shift. So if you're a leader, you can't do it all yourself, right? You can't put the superhero cape on. You really need to have a team of people, advisors who can help you work your blind spots. And I will say the other thing that I think is really tough for leadership right now and leaders in general is that there's so much pressure to be fully present all the time with your employees and stakeholder capitalism. As a leader, you want to be seen, you want to be heard. At the very same time, I think what leaders really need to do is like go off in a cave for 2 weeks and hide and think, because to me, the right question is now worth 10x a good answer. And the reason I say that is because I think answers, and we're all living this, right? Your answer can change sometimes week to week, but the right question will help sort of create a direction for the company to explore. And so to me, like the art of asking good questions has always been important, but I think it's become so much more important now.
Okay, I could do that. And maybe I've even improved my skills at being able to do that. However, in the book you talk about, we're still going to have stoplight moments. What is a leadership stoplight moment?
It's based on a story from one of the CEOs where he was driving along, and I think he was planning to take the company public, and then the financial crisis hit, and he realized that he was in his car at a stoplight, and the light had turned green, and he was still sitting there in his car, and he was so overwhelmed by the decision and the uncertainty. He was just sort of paralyzed for a second, and I think. And he talks, when he mentors leaders, he talks to them about like, you are going to have these stoplight moments. And what it really means is like, you are going to have a crisis. You are going to have those moments where you literally don't know what to do. And you just feel tremendously overwhelmed. And leadership is lonely. We know that. But it is in those moments where you simply have to find a way. I mean, part of the art of being a leader is being able to make a decision when there's no right answer, when the decision you make is going to anger some constituents, and to have the courage to do it and own the consequences. So to me, it was just a great metaphor. If you are a leader, you are going to have those stoplight moments, whether you're in a car or not.
Well, and even in the book, and what I like is talking about your first response, and your first response is to pull over.
Exactly. Always good advice.
Okay. So one of the things that stood out to me as well is you talk about a do to say ratio. So what is, that we need to perfect that do to say ratio. So what is a do to say ratio?
Sure. I first heard this from a CEO named Brett Wilson. I fell out of my chair when I said it because I thought it was so brilliant. And it basically means like, what percentage of the things that you say you're going to do you actually do? And I know that sounds simple, but when we think about all the people that we've worked with in our career, like you basically put people on a spectrum, right? At one end, there's those people who they say they're going to do something and you don't have to worry about it because you know they're going to do it, right? It's like money in the bank. You don't have to think about it. And then there's other people at the other end who say, Jim, I'm going to get you that report on Thursday. And you say to yourself, no, you're not. You're probably not going to do that, right? And then Thursday comes around, you go, remember that report? It's like, oh, yeah, I'll get it to you Monday. And you're thinking, no, you're not, right? And my rule, and I probably should have been more explicit about this when I was a manager myself, but it's like, if I have to keep your to-do list on my to-do list, like that's not a good use of my brain space, right? And so I would say, one of the sections of the book is really sort of career advice for grownups, not college grads. If you really want to set yourself apart, is just to have a great do to say ratio when you're working with, whether it's your boss or your peers or colleagues. If you always do what you say you're going to do, and if you can't, you tell people you can't. Like, I know I promised you that, but this happened, so I'm not. But just so that if you're just always perfecting that do to say ratio, it's going to build your reputation as reliable, as trustworthy, because most people don't have a great do to say ratio. And the other thing I like about this idea is that it's not like some big mystery. It's not like, you have to go do like 1,000 crunches every day. Like, improving your do to say ratio is really simple. If you say you're going to do something, just write it down. Right? However you do it, on your phone or paper list or on your laptop or whatever, I said I was going to do that. Just write it down and follow through. It's not that hard. But honestly, I always tell people, if you want to move up quickly and set yourself apart, if you just do the basics really, really well, you're going to get more promotions than you even expected.
Well, I think to me, what you're explaining is what I call a trust magnet. If you want people to trust you and you want to, get that type of perception and therefore reputation, I think, as you explained it, that do to say ratio is vital.
Yeah, it's so core. And again, it's such a simple rule. And I wish more people followed it. And again, if you are ambitious and want to move up, it's a pretty easy way to build that trust, because that's the key word, right? Being seen as trustworthy, as reliable, a solid teammate. Yeah, give it to Jim. I know he's going to deliver.
Well, and I guess part of that, and maybe this component goes into it, but and a lot of people don't even think about this, but you talk about managing your boss. So how do you manage your boss?
To me, it's almost like an act of empathy, right? And that people talk about that word, but to me, what it means is being able to see the world through somebody else's eyes, right? And I think you have to try and see the world through your boss's eyes and understand, the key scoreboard they are looking at for their success, the things that are on their plate, and ideally even see, through the eyes of your boss's boss, right? Just to get that sort of altitude of what they're dealing with, and then to take stuff off their plate, right? Like, you have to figure out how to do your job, what's expected of you, really well, and you need to become almost like an efficiency expert. Like, whatever job I have, how do I figure out how to do this faster? Because what you need to do is create some space in your schedule to be able to go to your boss and either say to them, like, what do you got on your plate that I can take off your plate? Point one. Or point two, maybe there's something that the department or the team needs that they don't even see, that you can do. Again, go beyond the sort of job description you have. And so to me, that's a key thing. The other thing too, and I heard this from co-author of my last book, The CEO Test, a guy named Kevin Scherer, who was the CEO of Amgen. When he was moving up in his career, he sort of preempted the performance review that his boss would give him. And he would have a conversation with his boss, and basically say, hey, boss, look, and he used a sports metaphor. I've reviewed my own game film, and this is where I think I've done well, and this is what I think I need to work on and improve. What do you think of that? And to me, and he said, you can't sugarcoat that, right? Like, you can't say, I think I did a great job this year because I showed up to work on time. Like, that's not enough. You have to have the courage and confidence to be brutally honest about your own performance. But I think if you do that with your boss, first of all, it gives them a running start on your performance review. And it also creates this environment where you're much more likely for your boss to want to mentor you and coach you. Because to me, when I was a manager, one of the most important things to me was simply do you want to get better at your job? Right? Because not everybody does. But if you show me that you want to get better at your job, then when I was a manager, I was all in. I want to help you. And so if you show your boss, it's this is where I think I can improve this. Please give me some advice. That's going to be a great performance review rather than something just checking the box.
Well, and talking about that performance review and thinking about, my own performance and maybe reading my own film, you talk about the art of compartmentalization. So what is the art of compartmentalization?
Yeah. So listen, as I said, these leadership jobs are really hard. And I think, in the spirit of self-awareness, some people are really good at compartmentalizing. I mean, I've certainly seen people in my career who, at least it seemed like things were rolling off their back, right? Like they're just dealing with a lot. There's just a ton of pressure in these top jobs. You're always being second guessed. You're always being criticized. You're always making decisions for which there's no right answer, and whatever answer is going to anger some people. So you have to be clear with yourself of are you able to compartmentalize? Are you able to sort of keep those things in perspective and kind of shut the mental door on those when you need to focus on something else, or frankly, when you need to sleep at night. Other people, and honestly, like I would put myself in this camp, is that other people have a little more of a challenge with compartmentalization. Like when I was at work, I would also often kind of let stuff, chew at me a little bit, or I'd be staring at the ceiling at 2 a.m. And so you need to be honest with yourself about whether you're able to do that. And I'm not saying like being amazing at compartmentalization kind of has its downsides too, because often people who are really good at compartmentalizing, they don't have a lot of EQ, right? They don't really necessarily read the room or are able to pick up on people's body language and things like that. Or maybe they don't worry as much as they should about the consequences of their decision. But at the other extreme, it's not good either, right? You can't be, so empathetic and internalize so much that that's actually going to cripple you. So it's yet another like balancing act of leadership.
Well, I think, they talk about our strengths, and overuse of them then becomes a deficit or a deficiency. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about here is, how do we actually work the levers to kind of stay in that good range, so we don't fall into the bad areas because we've overused a particular skill that otherwise would have been a strength.
Yeah, and it's a great point about self-awareness, and just people should ask themselves and be aware of this phenomenon that you described, which is every strength can also be a weakness in other contexts, or if it is not understood, right?
Well, then you also talk about the importance, and you kind of hit on this a little bit, and I kind of want to be a little bit more succinct in talking about it, is that we need to build a network without networking. And I think when we think about networking and building a network, it often gets very, very, like you were saying, you get all kinds of different perspectives in regards to it. So let's hear what you're meaning in regards to, I need to build a network without networking.
Yeah. And so I'm coming at this from the fact that I'm an introvert and I don't like networking, and I'm not good at it in sort of the traditional sense, right? Because I think a lot of people, they hear the word networking and it means, like you go to a conference in the happy hour and you sort of shake a lot of hands. You might exchange business cards, connect with people on LinkedIn, and people will think, okay, I'm networking. And yes, you are. But I just feel like, and I'm saying this for all the introverts in your audience who don't like the idea of networking because it feels transactional. Maybe it doesn't feel authentic, but you need to do it, right? You need to build your network because your network is in many ways going to help determine your career path. And so I find the best way to network is to actually do things with people rather than just having coffee or a drink or a hi, how are you, or send a check-in email. And you can do that inside your organization because organizations are always starting up ad hoc committees to study culture, to study innovation. Like raise your hand, join those things. You'll meet people from other departments and you will work on something and produce something. And in that, I mean, you really get to know somebody and people can see you in action and say, wow, like you're really great. I want to hire you for our department. You can do that outside your organization, volunteering for different organizations, whether it's boards or whatever. But I just think that, if you, first of all, you should network, but you don't like the idea of networking in the sort of transactional sense. You just need to make an effort, put yourself in positions where you're meeting new people and actually working on something.
As you were talking, I started thinking about if we were to, kind of think about a playbook, right? Is that networking is a party, a network is personal.
Right. That's good. That's good.
And you're right. We have to do it. And I think one of the phrases is your network reflects your net worth. And I think that happens at all levels. We hear you're going to be a direct reflection of the 5 people who you hang around the most. I mean, all of those things are so true. And unfortunately, we don't, especially with my teenage kids at certain points of them growing up, is I don't want you hanging around with them. But why? Well,
no, exactly. And I have to say, I mean, when I started the Corner Office series in the New York Times, I mean, everything looks like it makes perfect sense in hindsight. But it's been a great way. Sorry. Start that over. For me, in terms of building a network as an introvert, the Corner Office series that I started at the New York Times has just been it's just been kind of a gift, because I have met so many great people, had so many interesting conversations. We did work together insofar as, we created an interview as an outcome from it. And from the now more than 1,000 people that I've interviewed, I've made a lot of lifelong friends. And in terms of setting my career path, the Corner Office series that I did at the Times, I met a guy named David Reimer, who is the CEO of my current firm. And I never expected I'd leave the New York Times, but, a bunch of things happened, and he and I had become friends, and we kind of knew each other and trusted each other. So, for all the introverts out there, the effort that you put into building your network and find a way to do it in a way that feels authentic to you, it will pay off.
Well, and that's even a lesson for the extroverts is, don't see it as transactional. Because
Right.
they could potentially fall into that arena. Hey, I love just meeting and greeting everyone. Oh, yeah, but are you really
Exactly.
getting below the surface level? Because that's the differentiating factor there. Okay, so we've hit on this a little bit, and we've talked about complexity. And I think as a leader, we have to be extremely mindful. Our EQ has to raise when in association with thinking about fear, both our own, as well as our organization. Heck, we can even extend it to our entire ecosystem. Talk about customers. If I have, just stakeholders, you talk about that. What do leaders need to know about fear?
I'll start the answer with an insight that I heard from a CEO, a young woman that I interviewed many years ago. And I have to say, it was one of those moments where, you hear something, it just gets burned into the back of your brain. And she had this insight, and it was simply that reality is just source material. And what she meant is, as we go through experiences of our days and stuff, we often think this is reality, but we need to acknowledge that we are creating stories for ourselves about how we're experiencing reality, right? It's in effect, we're always editing the film or rewriting the history, and we are telling ourselves stories about our life, our experience, what we're experiencing now, our childhood, right? We are creating narratives. And I think starting with that insight, it helps you step outside yourself a little bit and say, what story am I telling myself? What narrative am I telling myself? And there's a couple of traps that people can fall into. And one is the fear trap, right? They think, I want to do this, but I don't want to rock the boat. Or what if it doesn't work, right? What if I fail? But then you need to sort of stop and say, but what does failure mean in this? What is honestly the worst thing that could happen? And if you think it didn't work out and it's a failure in whose eyes? Your eyes? Other people's eyes? What's the framework about that? And so it's just a really, to me, sort of handy device to sort of analyze yourself. And sometimes you have like a mentor or coach or a best friend who can help you, figure out the logistical kinks in your narrative and say, that doesn't actually add up. But just to be aware that sometimes people are fearful of things that they shouldn't be. Another narrative trap is the victim trap, right? Things are happening to me. They're not happening to me. You're experiencing them, and you're going to learn from them. And ask yourself what you can learn from that. So to me, just that insight for me, I think it's hugely important personally. And I think, look, we all have like friends, and, Jim, you probably mentor and coach a lot of people yourself, but just that insight, just drawing people out to understand the narrative. What story are you telling yourself? So you can say to them, come again. I didn't quite follow that last part, and help them see, maybe the logistical faults in what they're saying.
Okay. So then for us, we've had a lot of discussion in regards to do's and don'ts and complexities and all of that. And in the book, you talk about X factors, and talking about all these different interviews and all the research and all the studies and all the contradictions and all the changes. What are the X factors that are going to have a greater impact on leadership?
I'll go back to simplifying complexity and embracing complexity. I think you simply have to do that if you're going to lead. I will go to listening, because I think listening is an underrated superpower of leadership. It's not taught in business schools, but you simply have to be a great listener as a leader, not only to make sure people feel heard, whether it's one-on-one or in small groups, but you need to listen for all those signals about what's wrong inside our companies. What's the challenge? You need to listen for what's going on in the world that I need to worry about, I need to worry about more and learn more about. And so to me, those are just a couple of things. I mean, the leadership conversation, I often think of the metaphor I use as sort of Russian nesting dolls, right? There's a lot of ideas, but when you really think about it, a lot of them are nested inside each other, like listening and empathy and trust and followership. All these are sort of big ideas, but I think you have to have, in terms of like the skills, the engaging with the world skills, I'll put at the top, simplifying complexity and listening. But then on the internal stuff, I think we're at this moment where leaders have to do much more of that internal excavation about these questions about why do I want to lead, and who am I as a leader? Because I always say that when people are moving up in their career, they're always taught to have their elevator pitch ready, right? In case they get on the elevator with a CEO. But those elevator pitches are always one of two things: to have the answer to the question, what are you working on? What do you want to do next? But I think people need to prepare a third elevator pitch in case somebody asks them a question, who are you as a leader? And I think a good answer feels like, these are my 3 or 4 values that are really important to me. And then to be able to answer the double click questions. This is why they're important to me. This is how they became important to me. This is why I have found them to be important for driving success. Because if you are clear on your own personal values as a leader, I think that will translate into a greater sort of presence and a look of calm and confidence in your eyes. You become more trustworthy because people will understand what's important to you and then they can focus on the work rather than trying to figure out what mood you're in today. So again, we could have this conversation for hours, but those are 3 things that I would put at the top of the list.
So talking about what's important to you, you've written several books, you're, used to be with the Times and Newsweek, and, you've had this journey and all this happened. What's one of your goals at the moment?
My goals are in terms of my personal leadership values.
I don't want to frame you.
Well, in terms of things that are really important to me, because, I often deal with cohorts of up and coming leaders and ask them to reflect on their personal leadership brand. And so I decided to put myself through it. It's like, I was a manager for many years, but it's like, well, what's really important to me? What would somebody say to me or what would I say to somebody if they asked me, like, what's important to you as a manager, as a leader? And I'd say like a few things. One is, everybody's always got to be getting better, right? Like, I just find, again, there's only 2 kinds of people in the world. There's people who want to get better at their job, and there's people who don't. And I really appreciate people who want to get better at their job. To me, like, that is so important. Secondly, I love this quote that I heard from a CEO about building a culture of teamwork. And she said, "We are all subcontractors to each other." And I love that insight, because it's like, it doesn't matter what your title is. Everybody needs something from somebody else. And if you have that mindset, like, I don't like politics, I don't like drama, I don't like side agendas. And to me, that phrase captures it. The third thing I'll mention is that I think you really need to be true to yourself. I mean, I've seen a lot of bad bosses in action and bad managers. And I think I always have a problem with people who are sort of shapeshifters, depending on the context, right? Sometimes they're managing up their boss and they seem to become different people, or they're under stress and they become a different person. My late father, he always thought the best of people, but he had this phrase for people, he called them upsuckers, right? People who would like suck up to bosses. And he just had such a problem with them. And I inherited that. Like, I have a simple rule in life. Like, I am never going to laugh harder at a boss's joke than the joke deserves. Because we've all been in meetings, right? We've all been in meetings where the boss tells the jokes and all of a sudden they're like Kevin Hart, like everybody around the table is going, oh my God, like boss, that is the funniest joke I've ever heard. And we all know why they do it, but I will never do it. And if there are consequences to that, I'm happy to accept them.
And the Fast Leader Legion wishes you the very best. All right, here we go, Fast Leader Legion. It's time for the Hump Day Hoedown. Okay, Adam, the Hump Day Hoedown is the part of our show where you give us good insights fast. So I'm going to ask you several questions, and your job is to give us fast but yet robust answers. And so here is our first question. What is holding you back from being an even better leader today?
I want to honestly just live in the present more. I've developed this skill over the years where I'm always scanning the horizon and always looking for patterns and things like that. And that has served me really well, but I'd like to sort of shift the balance to just living in the present a little more.
And what is the best leadership advice you have ever received?
It was from my father, who was a journalist for many years and an editor. And he passed along the advice that somebody passed along to him, which is, as an editor, you should edit the person, not the words. And what he means by that is like, focus on the person, not the work that they are doing. And I took that to heart as an editor, as a manager. You should always be focused on how can you make the person better? And yes, you do that through their work, but it is about the person that you're coaching, not about fixing the work they're doing.
And what do you feel is one of your best tools that helps you lead in business or life?
I'll go back to sort of pattern matching. I'm pretty, if you show me 1,000 things of something, Jim, I'm going to start spotting the patterns in it. I think that's a pretty good skill. And I'm also a pretty good listener. I go through life. I mean, you're doing podcasts. To me, life is a podcast, right? Like, I just love talking to people and asking them, what have you learned? How did you learn it? Tell me the story. I just think you can, if you really talk to people and draw them out and hear their insights, you can just add a lot of wisdom to your years beyond your chronological age. And so that's one of my goals.
And what would be one book you'd recommend to the Fast Leader Legion? And it could be from any genre. Of course, we're going to put a link on your show notes page to Leap to Leader as well.
That's great. I'd say The Heart of the Sea, the sort of whaling book. I love adventure books, and I love people reading about what people do when they're in really tough circumstances and showing a lot of resilience, dealing with adversity. And to me, that's just a great example of the genre.
Okay, Fast Leader Legion, you can find out that and more information by going to fastleader.net and doing a search for Adam Bryant. Okay, Adam, this is my last Hump Day Hoedown question. Imagine you were given the opportunity to go back to the age of 25, and you can take the knowledge and skills that you have now back with you, but you can't take it all. You can only take one. So what skill or piece of knowledge would you take back with you, and why?
I would say to my younger self, just enjoy the ride more. With careers, like, you're always sort of planning, and back when I was younger, again, I was always sort of like scanning the horizon, again, it was really good, and it served me well in my career. And I'm pretty good at scanning the horizons and spotting patterns and stuff. But every strength can also be a weakness, right? And so I would say that if I could change the balance a little more, shift the dial a little bit, it probably would have added in a little more. Just enjoy the ride.
Adam, I have had a fun time chatting with you today. How does the Fast Leader Legion get in touch with you?
Couple of ways. My personal website is adambryantbooks.com. Please connect with me on LinkedIn, where I've got 4 different interview series about leadership. And our firm is excoleadership.com, EXCO leadership.com.
Adam Bryant, thank you for sharing your knowledge and wisdom and helping us all get over the hump. Thank you for joining me on the Fast Leader Show today. For recaps, links from every show, special offers, and access to download and subscribe, if you haven't already, head on over to fastleader.net so we can help you move onward and upward faster.